shift for a second, as David suggested, and look at America broadly in the 1990s. And I want to emphasize something that I always emphasize to my students. Our challenge today, especially today in the age of the blogosphere, in the age of red versus blue, in the age of so much polarization between Republicans and Democrats, is can we talk about politics? Can we talk about partisan issues? Can we talk about someone who tomorrow night is going to be debating in Las Vegas, running for President of the United States, without falling into the partisan vortex? Can we talk about politics without partisanship? And that's one of our challenges today. We want to buckle our seatbelts and go back in time to the 1990s and try to remember what we saw then, but also, having learned a little bit, hopefully, in the last quarter century, see how things that were occurring then now look, now feel, now seem. And the question is really, to what extent was it a golden age, and to what extent wasn't? You know, we historians, we like to make it very simple, golden age or not, right? It's a reference to that popular culture mime throughout the 1990s where you'd say, I really like you, not, which was very popular in Saturday Night Live. But the challenge here is to kind of see and sift through the blessings and the curses of the period. And it really was, in many ways, a magical period. Remember Mikhail Gorbachev and George H.W. Bush? Remember the Cold War? If we go back to 1990, it was a time when the Soviet Union was united, Germany was divided. Amazon was just a mighty big river. Google, a number with lots and lots of zeros. And PayPal, something a loan shark said to you on an unhappy day. All these things were being invented in the 1990s. All these changes were taking place. And it's our goal to try to understand them, to try to see what was occurring. And what we're going to do, what I do in my book, is use Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton as the central characters. Because there are certain decades, the 1930s with Franklin Roosevelt, the 1980s with Ronald Reagan, the 1990s with Bill Clinton, and to a certain extent Bill and Hillary Clinton, where the president so dominates not just the political universe, but the cultural universe, that it's interesting to me as a presidential historian to ask, how did the culture affect the presidency? And how did the presidency affect the culture? And I argue that in some ways the only way to understand the presidency, the only way to understand the Clintons, is to look at them in context. And I actually had the opportunity to go to Little Rock, Arkansas a couple of months ago. Anybody ever been there? I hope no one's from there. It's a pit. I mean, it is really small. And you go there and you go, God bless America. What an extraordinary country. That someone, you know, he was called governor, but it was barely mayor. 3.2 million people in Arkansas at the time. Someone who was governor of that very small state, someone who grew up in the backwaters, this man from Hope, because that was the name of the city in which the village in which he was raised, could make it to the presidency. And Bill Clinton has this defining moment when he's 16 years old. He's part of a youth congress sent to Washington. And with a skill that he still has, he somehow elbows his way to the front and is one of the few who's there to greet John F. Kennedy. And this is a picture that was buried away in the Kennedy Library. And at some point during the 92 campaign, Clinton had mentioned offhand that he had been there, he'd met Kennedy, and his little researchers went researching. We academics have to know how important it is to research. And this picture wasn't shown during the entire primary campaign. And then it's Madison Square Garden, July 1992. People have gathered for the convention. And they show a movie called The Man from Hope. And they show this picture, and a gasp resounds through the convention hall. And it's really the passing on of the torch from John Kennedy to Bill Clinton. And we forget. But for many, many people, Bill Clinton was their John Kennedy. For baby boomers, he was their guy. This is your classic 1950s picture. Virginia Kelly Clinton with Bill and with Roger, although it was much more a Faulknerian household than a father knows best kind of household. She was married a whole bunch of times. He had a very tumultuous relationship with his stepfather, Roger Clinton. He never met his father, who died in a ditch months before he was born in an auto accident, which might have involved some drinking, but we'll put that aside. And baby boomer that he is, he becomes a little bit of a mountain man when he meets Hillary Clinton in Yale Law School. And they meet. Hillary Clinton is from Chicago. He, as I said, from Arkansas. And there's a fascinating dynamic between them even then. He remembers that she was the smartest girl he'd ever met. And he explains to his mother, who's kind of disappointed that she's not one of these southern blondes, that he wants someone he can talk to. Someone, and this is kind of a mixed compliment, he can grow old with. And Hillary Clinton is fascinated by his just love of people. She's someone who was called Sister Frigidaire in high school. And his natural ability with people, his warmth, his love of humanity is something that appeals to her. He becomes the youngest governor in Arkansas history and one of the youngest governors in American history, and certainly the youngest governor at the time in the 1980s. And there they are meeting Ronald Reagan, ideological enemies, but both as the young governor with the older president. And later when Clinton's elected, there'll be a certain kind of affinity. In fact, Bill Clinton learns how to salute from Ronald Reagan, because of course Bill Clinton was more famous as a draft dodger than as commander-in-chief. And in 1992, Bill Clinton comes in as his young baby boomer, and everyone knows that he's not going to win, because George H.W. Bush is Reagan's heir, is the man who won the Gulf War, but Bush is struggling with a recession. He's not a natural politician. He doesn't have Reagan skills, and he certainly doesn't have Clinton skill. And then you'll also remember the man in the middle there who takes away a lot of votes from George H.W. Bush, Ross Perot. And in both Bill Clinton's presidential elections, to his frustration, he never wins more than 50% of the vote. But, we have this little thing called the Electoral College, and he gets a healthy percentage there. And Clinton is this fascinating character who is very much a political figure, but also a cultural figure. Here he is when his campaign is in the doldrums. And to jazz it up, he goes on Arsenio Hall, hip talk show at the time, puts on the shades, and plays the sax. And the drummer is so impressed, he says, Bill, if the saxophone career doesn't work for you, you might do okay in politics too. Here we see George H.W. Bush, sure he's going to win, with the great hero of the Gulf War, Norman Schwarzkopf. And the Gulf War had been this opportunity for America to exorcise the demons of Vietnam. And America feels like it's strong. America feels like it's tall. And George H.W. Bush has popularity ratings of over 90%. But that's 2 years before the election day. And on election day, it doesn't help. And I want to show the series of these pictures to remind us that the Clintons were young ones. That charisma, the excitement, the energy that he gives off. This is him in his role as Bubba, also known as Elvis. And they're with a young Hillary Clinton. And the two of them give off this vibe of just excitement, of a new generation, of carrying the torch from John Kennedy, of carrying the torch from the baby boomers growing up. And what you also see during this final surge in the 1992 campaign, the first couple months, New Hampshire, Iowa are rocky. But after the convention, there's this growing momentum. And they seem to be having fun together. She has a little bit of a fashion faux pas there with the coat, but we won't mention that. They seem to be falling in love with each other again. And one of the things I've learned from a book that I wrote about presidential marriage, and you certainly learned from the Clintons, dare we call it operatic marriage, that marriages ebb and flow, they go up and down. Long, sustained marriages have moments where you sometimes fall out of love and moments where you fall sometimes in love again. And when you see these pictures, and this is them celebrating Bill's birthday with a sock hop, you see them really falling in love again. And Hillary's not that good an actor. She couldn't pull it off if it wasn't true. The other big couple of the 1992 campaign is Al Gore, Bill and Al. Bill picks a vice president, not who's different, Not who's going to complete the ticket, but someone who's going to extend the ticket and really emphasize the baby boomer messaging, another Southern baby boomer, and it works. And there we have the foursome on their famous bus tour, again to show energy, excitement, idealism. The baby boomers taking over. And the surge of energy with Clinton and the crowds. I had an awkward moment after the Clinton election. I was on the job market, and I was being interviewed by a very serious woman dean of a college, and she tells me, we start talking about Bill Clinton, and she kind of sighs, and she tells me, I kind of had a crush on him. In fact, all my women friends were passing around, this is now early in the age of email, she says, we're passing around a list of the 12-step program for getting over your crush on Bill Clinton. And like, what do I say? I'm a white male in 1993. I go, and change the subject. There they are, Habitat for Humanity, a young Chelsea Clinton, Hillary. And here they are on Inauguration Day. Some people said that her hat looked like a flying saucer had landed on her head. She, over the course of her 8 years as First Lady, would constantly be changing her style, changing her hairstyle, because she'd be constantly being attacked as the first feminist First Lady, generating so much controversy, generating so much discomfort. And she herself is struggling, who am I going to be? How am I going to take on a role in this administration independently, but also as the missus, in this most traditional of roles, but also trying to make an impact on policy. And there he is, of course, with his famous saxophone celebrating the 1993 inauguration. And the inauguration becomes a kind of moment where the baby boomers feel like, this is our moment, we've arrived. So much so, and there are so many baby boomer celebrities. There's Little Richard, Michael Jackson, Chevy Chase in the background of the tuxedo there, and Barbra Streisand's there. Kermit the Frog shows up. That on Saturday Night Live, that Saturday night, the two kind of stoned out guys from Wayne's World go, hey, Bill, don't you know it's not the 60s or the 70s anymore, it's the 90s, man. Clinton has a remarkable string of accomplishments. So those of you who hold on to your hats, we'll get to the downside, but let's first look at the upside. In November 1993, in a really bold moment, he goes to the church in Memphis where Martin Luther King preached his last sermon. And his speechwriters would be very disappointed with what happened, but his speechwriters written this whole long talk that he was supposed to give about NAFTA, about the North American Free Trade Agreement. And he stands there in front of 5,000 African-American pastors, and he puts aside that text, and he talks to them as a Southerner who loves blacks, as a Southern white who grew up with a grandfather who taught him to be respectful toward African Americans, to give them credit in the grocery store the grandfather ran, to speak to them as human beings, not to buy in to the racism that was around them. He speaks to them as a friend, and he talks to them about crime, and he talks to them about family breakdown, and he talks to them about a need for values. And they see this, when you see the video, there's kind of a moment of hesitation, and then they realize that they're hearing it from a friend, and they start clapping, they start hallelujahing, and he says, Martin Luther King, if he could come back after 25 years and see all the good that he'd done, would be so impressed with the progress of African Americans, so impressed with the change in white America, so impressed with the fact that racism is no longer respectable. But Martin Luther King would also say, did I live and die to see so much crime on the streets? Did I live and die to see young people afraid to go to school? Did I live and die to see so much black on black crime? And unlike the way the conversation is now turned, Bill Clinton was able to convince the African American community that crime wasn't a black versus white issue, it was a white and black issue, and get everyone working together to fight crime. Everyone working together to mobilize 100,000 police on the streets. Because as a liberal, Bill Clinton understood that you couldn't have a sustained liberalism. You couldn't have faith in government if the most basic task of the government, protecting the people, wasn't being achieved. And he also understood, having lived through the Reagan era, that if they stayed stuck within the framework of the Great Society, liberals wouldn't be able to progress. And so he talks about a third way. He talks about a new path. And Bill Clinton is often looked at as a will-o'-the-wisp, finger in the air, poll-driven politician. But when you look and see speeches he gave in the mid-1980s, so it was called the Democratic Leadership Council, a group of Southern moderates like himself trying to save liberalism from itself, trying to revive liberalism, trying to save progressivism. And you look at his presidential announcement speech, you see that he had a take. He wanted to be a liberal who fought crime. He wanted to be a liberal who ended welfare as we knew it. And you see that in many ways, this is one of the controversial things I say, is that Bill Clinton was as ideological a president as Ronald Reagan. Not the same ideology, but with a take, with an anchor. And of course, neither Reagan nor Bill Clinton could always follow that ideology, but there was a certain attempt to understand things. Here he is signing the legislation to end welfare as we know it on the eve of the 1996 campaign, partially because he understood that he couldn't face the American electorate again without having fulfilled that promise. And it was a difficult debate in the Clinton White House whether to sign the bill, which the Republicans were pushing and had added certain limitations on immigration, things that Clinton didn't like. But he said, I'd rather have this bill and I'd rather try to have some Republican-Democratic unity. Now, let me say that again, because we don't really have it in the country. I'd rather have some Republican-Democratic unity. I'd rather have some cooperation. I'd rather us go forward than have yet another stalemate. And so he compromised and they compromised. And the Republicans themselves had turned to their leader, Newt Gingrich, and said, we need to make this bill happen because it's one of our key points in our contract with America. So we too need to compromise. I'm emphasizing that point because it's badly needed. And as I said, Bill Clinton understood as a Southerner what African Americans had endured. And one of the really most moving moments of his presidency, this kid who was, when he was 12, had heard about the Little Rock Nine, kids who wanted to go to school, who were not welcomed in their own schoolhouse because they were black. So 40 years later, in 1997, Bill Clinton and the governor of Arkansas, Mike Huckabee, get together in Little Rock at that same schoolhouse, and they invite those same 9 kids who had been barred from the door from entering the Little Rock schoolhouse. And the President of the United States and the governor of Arkansas stand and greet each one of them. And when one of the Little Rock Nine, overcome by emotion, has her knees buckle, the President of the United States and the governor of Arkansas catch her. And to me, that's one of those moments that makes America great. It's one of those moments that reminds us that yes, we have an ugly, ugly, ugly legacy of racism. We have far too much violence. We have so many problems in our country. But we have that extraordinary democratic ability to be self-critical, that extraordinary democratic ability to repair, sometimes violently during the Civil War and sometimes on the whole quite non-violently during the Civil Rights Movement. And to see this moment is one of those moments we really should be proud. And Bill Clinton becomes the first Democratic president since Franklin Roosevelt to serve a second term and a second full term. And another one of his great accomplishments is, and it's obviously thanks to the prosperity that's going on, obviously thanks to the baby boomers boom that's going on. It's obviously, by the way, and he doesn't get enough credit, one of the things I also argue in my book is to give him more credit. It's obviously due to George H.W. Bush's budget cutting. Remember the famous read my lips, no new taxes, and then he broke that pledge. By breaking that pledge, he lost the presidency, but in some ways, he saved Bill Clinton's presidency. Because he put in motion some of the necessary cuts in the budget and some of the necessary increases in taxes that helped lead to that moment where the federal budget deficit, after decades of growing bigger and bigger, including during the Reagan years. Reagan did not cut government, he slowed the rate of governmental growth. There's a big difference to finally get to that zero budget. And broader, now to pull back our camera and look at what else is going on during the Clinton era. And again, we're still in the good news. Is I want to look at 5 major cultural phenomena, economic phenomena, social phenomenon that are occurring. First, what I call the Great American Hookup. The 1980s was about those magical machines called computers. But in the 1990s, those computers become everything and everywhere machines because they hook up with the internet. And that gives them a power. And then as they shrink, it's going to give them a ubiquity so that we can all go around, it's off, of course, with, and it should be for you too, with our little handheld computers hooked up to everyone all the time. It's mind-blowing. And here we see, this is actually one of my favorite pictures. It's Bill and Al looking just like Sunday fathers with their honey-do list. Honey do this, honey do that. But instead they're in a high school in California. And they were both committed to making sure that there wouldn't be a world of American internet haves and internet have-nots. Digital haves and digital have-nots. And one of their big initiatives was making sure that the United States of America was wired. That it wasn't a private initiative, it was a governmental initiative. And you know, the truth is, if we had a kinder political culture, we'd indulge Al Gore saying he was the father of the internet. Because even though he wasn't the scientist who invented it, he actually, even in the late 1970s and the early 1980s, was way ahead of his time in understanding that there was this amazing thing called the internet and pushing Congress to give it support. And both he and Bill Clinton did a lot in the 1990s to help, what was his cliche, build that bridge to the 21st century. Everybody made fun of it. They really were doing it. Our times, the things we're so used to now, are being invented then. And so, of course, the age of internet leads to the age of wizardry. Everybody's dazzled by this British fellow who lives both in the older traditional world, the world of magic, the world of witches, and also in some ways the world of wizardry, Harry Potter. So that's one, the digital revolution, the Great American Hookup. The second is the Rainbow Revolution. Bill Clinton gives an extraordinary speech in San Diego in 1997 saying, America is becoming increasingly multicultural, increasingly brown, and it's not just black versus white now. We're talking about a country which has more and more Hispanics, more and more Asians. The impact of the 1965 Immigration Act brought in so many different Americans that we're going to have to redefine what it is to be American. We're going to have to change in our own minds, he's speaking to whites, what an American looks like, what that rainbow is. A demographer would point out in 2010 that from 1990 to 2010, in those 20 years, an entire Venezuela's worth of Hispanics came to the United States. It's changing language, it's changing culture, it's changing our look, it's changing our assumptions. And here we see the growth from the Mexican-American population and the Hispanic population. Third phenomenon, what I call the gender bender. The sexual revolution. Anybody recognize these two ladies? Thelma and Louise, right? From 1992 in the wake of the Clarence Thomas, Anita Hill sexual harassment fight, with feminism supposedly on the way down, but in many ways feminism just becoming a part and parcel of American life, accepted, taken for granted. And in the 1990s we see with the feminist First Lady Hillary Clinton, who goes on to run for Senate, with so many ways in which women just become a part of the workforce. The dinks, the double income, no kids phenomenon, are part of changing expectations and changing roles of the family, and changing roles of gender. And of course, this is Bill and Hillary Clinton visiting the AIDS quilt when it's unfurled on Capitol Hill, changing understandings of the role of gays and lesbians in American life. And one of the tragedies, one of the ironies of the time is that the AIDS revolution, and I call it the AIDS revolution in addition to being the AIDS tragedy, the thousands who die, more Americans die from AIDS than died in the entire Vietnam War, 52,000, until they finally get a handle on it. And how do they get a handle on it? Through the magical technology, the marvelous medicines that we're able to invent. But during that time, as Americans become more aware of the AIDS crisis, as Americans become more aware of the AIDS tragedy, it helps mainstream gay life. It helps out people. It helps Americans become aware of the fact that whatever you do in your bedroom should not necessarily affect your public life. Oops, we had a little PowerPoint misfire there. We have what I call the contingency carnival. The contingency carnival, and Oprah Winfrey is kind of the queen of this and Bill Clinton is the king of this, is that in this world of technological change, in this world of changing gender identities and sex roles, more and more everything is up for grabs. The traditional script of the 1950s, which I'm sure some of you could tell me wasn't always followed, but was clear what we were supposed to do. The structures of the Cold War are all in the process of undergoing tremendous change. And we're seeing new heroes. We're seeing Nirvana and the grunge types. We're seeing the Beverly Hills 90210 gang, and how this television show becomes a vehicle for working through so many of the issues: drug abuse, changing sex roles, changing sexual behaviors of teens, male and female issues. And then we have what I call the information age reset, which is two things. One is just the boom, the easy money, the billionaires, the prosperity, the sense, and of course there's a big debate about how the wealth is distributed. But there's a sense in the 1990s that America has entered an age of permanent prosperity, of permagrowth. And it's partially triggered by all these amazing new technologies. And we go from being a traditionally blue-collar nation to an overwhelmingly white-collar nation. And fewer of us work with our hands. And fewer of us make things. And fewer of us can really explain what we do in a sentence. And we all become what Robert Reich calls symbolic analysts, moving data around, moving ideas around. Some say it makes for a more sophisticated workforce. Some say it makes for a more alienated workforce. We also see what we call the Walmartization of America, where more and more part-time work. And many of these companies understand that if you have many people working for few hours, you can get more out of them, and also you don't have to pay all kinds of health benefits. And we see the boom from Wall Street, and the Wall Street culture, the cowboy culture that emerges. And the joy of the Macarena. Remember that? And remember what this is? This is Al Gore doing the Macarena. That was a joke he told about himself because he was so stiff. And friends, what's the phrase from the opening song? Always stuck in second gear. What does it mean? It means it's kind of like a perpetual immaturity. And this is one of the great anomalies of the 1990s. Now we're starting to edge away from the Golden Age. There's so much good, there's so much wealth, there's so much health, there's so much prosperity. And yet, there's also a lot of anxiety. There's a lot of stress. There's a lot of unhappiness. There's a lot of cynicism from Seinfeld and from others. And just before we pick up that thread, let's take a look at what's happening in foreign policy. We see the sinking of the Soviet ship, as I said at the beginning, which was remarkable, and it occurs peacefully. We see the freeing of Nelson Mandela and the collapse of the South African apartheid regime occurring peacefully. We see the Northern Irish Accords, where the fight between the British and the Catholics in Northern Ireland ends peacefully. And we see the Oslo peace process, where decades of Palestinian-Israeli conflict end, no, I'm supposed to say peacefully. It was supposed to end peacefully. And there's tremendous progress. The Oslo genius, the genius of Oslo, and we can fight about Oslo, we can see its mistakes, and there certainly were on both sides. But the genius of Oslo was to start with the controversial occupied, liberated territories, you fill in the blanks, I'm not going to go there right now, we can do it in Q&A, of 1967, and say, the first thing we want to do is we want to minimize the number of Palestinians under Israeli rule. So as many Palestinian cities as possible, as many Palestinian population centers as possible become controlled by the Palestinian Authority. And here you see that, so it doesn't make for a clean, contiguous map. But rather than judging people by their land, it judges people by who they are, and says this series of those orange dots will allow the Palestinians to have some sense of personal autonomy, even in a broader, very complicated regime. And here we see a bonding moment between King Hussein of Jordan and Yitzhak Rabin of Israel, when indeed a Jordan-Israeli peace treaty is signed, and that peace treaty holds. I'm going to avoid any smoking will kill you jokes right there. And we see also in the Jewish world, as part of the excitement, part of the inspiration, new programs, new ways of being Jewish, such as Birthright, sharing the joy of Israel, which is not only undergoing what seems to be this perma-peace, because it's happening in the Soviet Union, it's happening in South Africa, it's happening in Northern Ireland, it must be happening in the Middle East too. And in addition, in Israel, they're starting the whole, what we call startup nation miracle. They're starting that extraordinary understanding that the kibbutz life was beautiful and had powerful, wonderful values, but you can't sustain a modern, sophisticated country on agriculture that's being raised in the Middle East. And so rather than harvesting plants, they start harvesting Jewish minds, and Jewish and Arab minds together, creating this extraordinary high-tech miracle. So all was good. And I'm sure you wish I could end the lecture right now, because we could just end with the happy thoughts. But I've got to give a few more minutes and a little bit more of the sobering side, because people had this notion that in the 1990s we escaped from history. And so in some ways, the 1990s also, history was going to return. We see Newt Gingrich in the Contract with America. I emphasize the moments of cooperation, the moments of alliance, the moments of progress, but there also was the growing deadlock. The words red and blue didn't mean Republican and Democrat at the start of the 1990s, but by the end of the 1990s, it'll be the symbol of deadlock. And here's a wonderful picture of the two baby boomers, Newt Gingrich and Bill Clinton, at one of their deadlocks, and even Bill Clinton has hit a wall. Remember OJ? And the absurdity of the trial, the way it made the American legal system look so impotent. But remember also that day, that split-screen day, when O.J. Simpson was found innocent by a jury of his peers, and overwhelmingly in white America they said, "Oh no!" And overwhelmingly in black America they said, "Hallelujah!" And for all the moments of racial unity that I emphasized, this was a very powerful moment of racial disunity. And the Rwandan genocide, and I underline the word genocide because this is actually one of the greatest failures of Bill Clinton. And during the months that 800,000 Rwandans were being slaughtered, the argument within the Clinton administration was whether or not to call it a genocide, because the Clinton administration knew that if it was formally called a genocide, then by the Genocide Convention that the United States had signed in the 1940s, the United States would be forced to act. And as a post-Vietnam baby boomer, Bill Clinton wasn't yet comfortable, this is 1994, and I say yet because it changed, using the American military, deploying the American military. And as a result, it was the French and the UN who ultimately stopped the slaughter after 800,000 had been killed and so many more had been raped and humiliated and orphaned. But Clinton learned his lesson and would be more activist in his foreign policy after that. And we see Hillary Clinton on a very uncomfortable day for her, where she's being forced to defend her husband against rumors that he's had an affair with an intern named Monica Lewinsky, and she dismisses it as simply the words of the vast right-wing conspiracy that has been after her husband from day one. Now, at that moment, she already knew that Bill Clinton, who was denying the affair both publicly and to his wife, had given Monica Lewinsky a book of Walt Whitman poems called Leaves of Grass, the same book of poems he'd given a young Hillary Rodham when they were courting. Ouch. We know that there was an awful moment in Oklahoma City when a homegrown, domestic terrorist, Timothy McVeigh, blew up the federal building and 168 people died. And here, Bill Clinton, in one of his powerful moments, as healer-in-chief, as mourner-in-chief, comes and helps lead the nation in mourning. And we also know perhaps the low moment of the Clinton administration when, because of the Monica Lewinsky things, which was connected to the Paula Jones sexual harassment suit, which was connected to the Ken Starr investigation, which was connected to the growing red-blue tensions, Bill Clinton became only the second president of the United States of America to be impeached. And like the first one, he was impeached but not convicted. Because to be impeached means simply to be kind of indicted by the House of Representatives, saying, we no longer think you're worthy. But the Senate got together and didn't want to convict him, didn't remove him from office. And Columbine, the scourge of school shootings, in a happy suburb, in a healthy suburb, in a wealthy suburb. Over a dozen teenagers shot, a teacher shot. And that was a failed plan, because what they had tried to do was they wanted to blow up the whole school. But the bombs that they had gotten on that new thing called the internet, the bomb recipe, hadn't worked. Again, raising the question, what's going on with American kids? What's going on with the American people? And Osama bin Laden, who attacks America again and again. 2 African embassies blown up. The USS Cole, docked in Yemen, blown up. An unknown but now revealed plot to assassinate Bill Clinton when he's visiting the Philippines discovered. And nevertheless, not enough is done to catch him. And it's not just Bill Clinton's fault, but it's the fault of the society.